All right. Hello again. Good evening, good night, and maybe good morning, good afternoon uh, to those who are joining from another time zone or by means of a recording. In either case, this is our fourth meeting in this sequence on the 7 points of mind training, which is an incredibly profound and precious text from the Indo-Tibetan tradition of contemplative training, which I am frankly am not capable of explaining at all, but I'll still pretend and will do my best. But I think because the instructions here are so clear, as long as we have all the words clear, as long as we understand all the terms and so forth, then it's hard to not receive some benefit when we're studying this, especially when we move on into the more obvious or more clear part of the text that has to do with cultivating love, compassion, all of those sorts of things through meditation. That's going to be a bit easier, at least for me. But right now we are in this unfortunate predicament where we are stuck in the part of the text that is talking about emptiness and the ultimate nature of the mind. And of course, to explain those things truly and especially to transmit the experience to a certain degree, to transmit the insight, you would have to have an actual teacher there. So what we can do, though, is still connect to the lineage of blessings, still open our mind up to this profound information, and still go through all the necessary movements associated with these practices. But before we do that, let's start with the preliminary meditation. And I think because there's not too many people today in person and online either, we can actually meditate a bit more and see how it works. So that's always nice to mix things up in that way. So let's find a comfortable stationary position in which we are positioning all the different elements of our body in order to support our practice. So one way to accomplish that if we're meditating in the upright position is to imagine that our spine is like the central axis of the universe itself, Mount Meru. And around this central axis, we place the continents and subcontinents of our limbs, all the other different parts of the body in a way that would look beautiful and that would also ensure the smooth and free movement of our inner energies. So literally just allowing everything to drop around this central axis. And we can follow the same logic even if we are meditating in the supine position. And once we have adopted this comfortable stationary position, we bring our awareness down into the body by mentally touching the ground, noticing the sensations that are arising in the parts of the body that are currently in contact with the ground beneath us. And then once we have noticed those sensations of firmness and stability, allowing them to trigger their relaxation response, releasing tension from the lower half of our body, which includes our feet and toes, our legs in general, our shoulders, our torso, our hands and fingers, and our facial muscles. Allowing our breath to move naturally, allowing our body to choose the optimal rhythm, volume, pace, and rhythm of breathing. And with our mind, noticing the sensations that are accompanying the breath, arising anywhere in the field of the body when we breathe in and when we breathe out. And this curious attention directed towards these experiences helps us gradually train our attention in single pointed concentration, gradually releasing the attentional imbalances of both excitation and laxity. We attend to the way the coarse pranas are moving through our body when we breathe in and when we breathe out. The coarse energy winds associated with the breath, manifesting as these sensations or tactile waves. This type of attentional training can serve as the foundation for all the subsequent steps in our main practice. Or it can serve as the main training where or when our main goal is to establish a stronger degree of attentional balance. So now that we have arrived at a greater degree of relaxation, stillness, and clarity, we can take some moments to establish a truly vast and positive motivation for the rest of this exchange, for the rest of our conversation today. And for that, we need to powerfully orient our mind towards our profound wish to become fully awakened for the benefit of all beings. In order to bring all beings to freedom from suffering and the greatest possible bliss, we need to wake up to our own clear, blissful nature. And that waking up will make us a Buddha. So we breathe life into this powerful resolve to not simply become a Buddha one day, but to use everything that we're doing right now in this session, in this specific meditation, as an aid to the fulfillment, to the realization of that goal. And then with that goal as the foundation for everything else that we do, we will do a tiny bit more of attentional training with the sensations of breathing arising throughout our body as an object. Just once again noticing those tactile waves and observing them with curiosity. And then with that greater degree of attentional stability, with this experience of training it a tiny bit, we return to the overall sensations in the field of the body, noticing them. And then we gently reactivate the body by rocking back and forth, moving our hands and fingers, reactivating the facial muscles, and slowly, gradually, gently transitioning out of this practice. So in the teachings on shamatha, which is this class of practices that we use to train our attention, there is a metaphor or an analogy given. And the analogy is that when we begin this training and our mind is quite unruly, we try placing it on an object, and but our mind is like a puppy. So we try holding it in one place, and then it runs off. And then what do? Well, we can't really discipline the puppy verbally, as in we can, but there's not that high degree of conceptual understanding. We can't promise it money and say, hey, if you sit in one place, you're going to get $500 or something. That's not going to work. And generally, the concept of bribery is not fully accessible across species. So then the strategy that's suggested, at least in this traditional Tibetan culture, is to take the puppy, very gently return it to the original place. And then it runs off again, and we bring it back to the original place. Then that happens again. The bone? A bone? Well, that's also a valid concern in that, a valid idea in that we could keep the puppy there because it's interested in being there. And that is the reason for why we usually try to choose a specific concentration technique that is personally interesting or inspiring to us. But outside of that, there's still a little bit of that activity of bringing it back, and eventually it will get tired of running away and will sit in one place. So we follow that logic until we cultivate a greater degree of stability. And as we have established last time, that is related to this aphorism of once stability has been attained, reveal the mystery. It's a secret aphorism in that it's not included in our translation because it's not present in all of the editions. But as we have talked last time, have discussed last time, that refers to two types of stability: stability of trust, of faith with regards to Dharma in general and this specific approach in particular, and mental stability attained through shamatha training and concentration practices. And then once we have established a certain degree of mental stability, let's pretend that we did. Because otherwise we'll have to just stay with that first aphorism and work with it for a few years, which would be super valid, but will not allow us to cover the text in 10 meetings. So maybe one day. And also that's something that we need to do in our personal practice. Just continue training in shamatha, continue training in attention and stability, which in addition to giving us that tool, eventually giving us the tool of a stable mind, and that stability of mind will be more and more deep as we continue training, along with the mind's ability to be restful or relaxed or at ease, and along with the mind's ability to be clear, to clearly illuminate the object. So we're training in these three qualities of relaxation, stability, and clarity. But in addition to gaining that, which will be super necessary for all the other types of meditation and inner transformation, we will be also experiencing a very profound therapeutic process, because shamatha practices have a very profound therapeutic dimension to them. Even the practice of attending to the breath that we have just done together. This specific approach to mindfulness of breathing that, as many people would know, because, for example, Lama Wallace often teaches this specific one, comes from the writings of the great Indian yogi Asanga, who was a master of different types of philosophy, a true master of many disciplines, including Pure Land practices and so forth, a true master of Buddhist psychology. He wrote some of the most authoritative texts on Buddhist psychology that we're still using to this day. The division of mind into different functions, factors, levels, layers, and so forth. So a true master of all of that. But in addition to that, one of the primary things that he emphasized in his own practice was the meditation on the Buddha of loving kindness, Maitreya. And there's a very famous story in how Asanga arrived at his knowledge and his understanding through succeeding in that practice after seemingly failing at it, and then in an act of compassion, finally removing the last obstacles that were preventing him from seeing Maitreya. That's a story to revisit another time, but why that is important is that we're thinking of a yogi of the highest caliber, and that yogi is teaching us to attend to the breath in the way that breath manifests throughout our body as these tactile sensations accompanying the inhalation and the exhalation. Across, amongst different types of mindfulness of breathing practices, this one is especially good for healing the body, for restoring the balance of the body. So in general, in the Buddhist tradition, and I think that's actually a cross-traditional idea, you have some practices in which you learn to harness the energies of the body and manipulate them skillfully. And we have master of that approach here. And also that's an approach that's taught to a certain degree in Hatha yoga practices and in many other traditions, in the Sufi tradition for sure, in the mystical Christianity tradition that is still maintained to this day in some Orthodox countries, including Greece on Mount Athos. You have these practices where the breath is used to manipulate the pranas in skillful ways. And then you have another approach, and they're not in contradiction to each other. They're not opposed to each other. They're complementary. But this other approach is to allow for perfect naturalness to occur, allow for the body itself to establish, to restore its balance. Just don't intervene, but be curiously attentive, or learn from the wisdom of the pranas themselves, of these subtle energies. Allow them to rebalance themselves by just removing that element of interference, that element of intervention that we typically do. Except we typically do it not through yogas or special breathing practices and so forth, but just by being super tight, super tense, super uptight, constantly overactivated in many ways, dispersing our attention in many different ways, and then also holding our breath as we're checking our email, all these sorts of unhealthy habits that we have. Remove all that, and the balance of the pranas will be restored naturally. So that's the approach Asanga is suggesting here. And to accomplish that, we just watch the process of breathing with curiosity. We watch those bodily sensations as they change with the inhalation and the exhalation. And to add that bone element, to keep the puppy of our mind in one place, we can think of it in additional helpful ways. For example, we can remind ourselves that the nature of breath, the nature of the element of air that is circulating through our body, and the element of air is not simply air itself. CO2, from this point of view, as long as it's moving, is also part of that element, as would any other moving thing. So this energy of air that is circulating through us and keeping us alive naturally is a healing agent. So when attending to the breath as it manifests in the body, we can keep ourselves interested in it by thinking, that's my healing ally. That's a healing energy, healing force, benevolent healing agent that I can just attend to. And as long as I'm inactive to the degree that's available to me and attentive, it will do a certain amount of healing on me. It will perform these healing acts by removing the unnecessary knots in our subtle and gross nervous systems, removing some of the knots of tension, tightness, and different afflictive mental states from our mind. So lots of good stuff will happen. That's something that we can establish experientially. Then on top of that, we can use other reminders and other metaphors. For example, following the same logic, some people inspire themselves to keep attending to the breath by reminding themselves that it's actually the female Buddha Tara that is manifesting as these pranas, because green Tara in particular, the Tara has many forms, but green Tara, through her color, represents the purified aspect of the air element. And so it's Tara's energy circulating through my energy channels, through my lungs, and just moving through me. So wow, how inspiring. I'll just keep watching her, and she'll do what's needed. And people in the theistic traditions equally think, well, that's the breath of God. Didn't she breathe life into all of us in the beginning of time? Well, how fascinating. Let me just see how that breath of God is moving through me. So there are all these tricks to keep our mind engaged. And yet we still need the puppy thing. We still need to keep bringing it back. And over time, greater stability is established. We then use it in order to succeed in the ensuing practices. But of course, the more we learn about these concentration practices in depth, the better. So there's quite a profusion on very advanced material on that. What are the 3 or 4 or 5 steps of training our attention, or sometimes 9 stages? There's different presentations that are all important and inspiring because they all give us different hints as to what to expect, what to strive for, what not to strive for, how to not overburden ourselves with expectations and pressure, how to be gentle with ourselves, what are the benefits of having stable attention. Lots of scientific and Buddhist material and non-Buddhist material as well. So that is all supporting us in concentration. But then we flip the page and we get to the so-called insight practices, as we have established. And last time we started with the first one. And the first one was described in the aphorism saying, ponder that phenomena are like a dream. So we have discussed this idea in general, and then we have revisited some verses from Longchenpa to illustrate that to a greater degree. But we basically settled on the fact that this is a type of meditation in which we first need to do at least a little bit of thinking, of discerning, discursively discerning something, and then we need to settle on what we have discerned. So what we need to discern here with this practice is the fact that everything in our personal sphere of experiences, in this projection that surrounds us, is like a dream, because just like a dream, all of this is arising on the basis of the holographic energy of our mind. So although there might be atoms and so forth, that's to be seen and that's to be established and discussed separately, my perception of tables and thermoses, and I have two in front of me, go figure, floors, cushions, other beings, that perception is occurring by means of these holographic appearances that my mind skillfully constructs. And it constructs them because I have human faculties. And so to a dog, the holographic appearances of all of this would be quite different. Same for all the other types of sentient beings. But in addition to that, we all exist within a personal bubble of experiences. They overlap in a way, in that we could put one singing bowl in front of all of us and say, are we all seeing this? And I would say yes. But the way we individually perceive it might be quite different. And that's even before we start talking about our interpretations of the singing bowl. Oh, it's the most divine singing bowl, or no, it's the most ugly singing bowl. Even in terms of simply the sensory appearance, there's already that holographic projection happening. So within a dream, we need to explain to ourselves, everything is arising out of that holographic energy of the mind. So we have buildings, and we have a dream persona, we have a dream body within it, but it is all fleeting and ephemeral, and it is all inseparable from the energy of the mind. There's no dream outside of the energy of the mind, not made from the energy of the mind. And here, although some of the laws are different in that we shouldn't attempt jumping from the window and expect to fly unless we're a very advanced yogi, or we wouldn't succeed at passing through a wall with the same ease that would be available to us within a dream. Well, once again, if you're a super advanced yogi, you would be able to do that, potentially. But outside of that, some of the laws are different, but the fact that perceptual objects of perception are made from the holographic luminous energy of the mind, that remains the same. And another simpler interpretation of this aphorism, which can also be a very worthy topic of this discursive or discerning meditation, analytical meditation, is thinking in the following manner. When I think of my experiences 10 years ago, they seem like a dream. It was a different me in a completely different set of circumstances, doing things that I wouldn't now even be doing. How weird, how bizarre. In a way, we then need to say, even when we go home after this session, or even in 3 hours from now, when we think back to this will all seem like a dream. It's no longer there. We kind of have some memories of it, but they're not particularly reliable. And what's the likelihood? You were listening to a former Buddhist monk talk about emptiness, in northern London, What's realistically the likelihood of that? No, it's just some weird fantasy you had, Oh, that's weird. Okay, back to my normal life. So from that point of view, even what to us right now seems fairly solid and real is completely ephemeral, and it will appear ephemeral in the long run. But when we are in the midst of a difficult situation, especially when we're suffering from heartbreak or something like that, or when we are experiencing elation, when we're experiencing arousal because we have been praised and everyone is saying how great we are. So either moments of intense suffering or moments of intense hedonic pleasure, we believe in their reality because the intensity of our feelings and emotions is so high. But were we to dial them down a little bit, even there we would say, yeah, it is kind of like a dream. It is kind of like an illusory projection, inseparable from the mind. Within that illusory projection, everything is dependent on the mind, made from the mind, reliant on the mind. And then we need to rest in that understanding, in that feeling. So that's what we started exploring. And ideally, we would train in this, alternating these brief periods of contemplation using different logical sequences, different types of reasoning, sometimes emphasizing the fact that, it is all inseparable from mind's holographic energy, sometimes emphasizing the fact that it's super impermanent and therefore there's nothing to grasp at. And we have many, many other logical sequences that we can follow. And then resting in that, allowing that to saturate our mind. When we do that, ideally, we would accumulate hours, dozens of hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours of such meditations. And although it might not seem like much, it will shift our lived reality so powerfully, it would be completely unrecognizable. We would gain a much greater degree of spaciousness, mental spaciousness as a result of that. So this brings us to a very important, but a very foundational conversation about what is the purpose of insight practices or vipassana practices, and how are they different from concentration practices. So there's a very specific and clear distinction there. Concentration practices, shamatha or samatha in Pali, are about training our attention, training our ability to focus, to concentrate, and so forth. And in order to train our attention, and it's a generalized explanation, we limit the scope of our awareness to something and we hold it there. So instead of being aware of everything at the same time or jumping from one object to another, in the practice that we just did with the breath, we limit the scope of our awareness to the sensations associated with the inhalation and the exhalation. We withdraw it even from the unrelated sensations in our left foot, in our right ear, and so forth. If those sensations are not directly related to the breath, they are irrelevant, so we abandon them and we withdraw our concentration into the process of breathing. If we were to follow a very standard approach of focusing on a visualized object, we would, for example, imagine the Buddha in front of us, or Tara, or our personal teacher, or a Siddh syllable, or an orb of light, or something like that. And we would withdraw our attention, our awareness from everywhere, from everything that is not that desired object. Let's say the visualized image of the Buddha. And as we keep focusing, ideally with a great degree of restfulness, ease in our body and mind, to not become too tight, which is a great danger in these practices when we focus on a visualized object. As we're doing that, we would again and again withdraw the threads of our attention and awareness that like to go elsewhere, to those sounds over there, to the conceptual stories with regards to this, to our memories of that. We again and again come back, we focus, we hold it there. And through that, our concentration becomes laser-like. So what originally was a very diffuse stream of light, not unlike any of these lamps, would become more and more and more focused. So now then we have a projector, and then in the long run, we need laser-like concentration, because that's what would allow us to penetrate the nature of reality eventually, or to succeed in any other type of practice. So gathering. There are practices in which we withdraw from everything at the same time to such a degree that only the bare bones of awareness are left. So those are called shamatha without an object, or shamatha without support, or shamatha without a reference point. That is sometimes understood incorrectly, in that people think, oh, shamatha without an object means just sitting there and being distracted all over the place. So, oh, I hear a bird, da 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 da, or these thoughts appeared, blah, 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 so we're just mind wandering. That's not quite what's meant. What's meant is that we withdraw interest from everything so fully that even though those objects might still be penetrating the domain of our awareness, awareness itself remains unmoved, its essential nature of clarity and cognizance is becoming more and more and more pronounced. And out of it come up the same qualities of relaxation, stillness, and clarity. So that's kind of different from just flying all over the place with our mind, which is often the mistake that we make when we hear these names. Oh, shamatha without an object. That just means I can be distracted all over the place. That's what I did the first time I heard about this method. And then when I have heard other ways of explaining it at training, and I was like, oh, okay, it's very different from what I was doing for a couple of months. And sometimes that happens for years. So, but still, there is that withdrawing, except this is withdrawing clear, pronounced interest from everything. Nothing is particularly interesting, and the only thing to do is to rest in the unmediated clarity of the mind itself. Then out of it will come up concentration. So there is an approach of that nature as well. But for most shamatha practices, we just limit our attention to something. And they also include such practices as concentrating through loving kindness, concentrating through compassion, concentrating through empathetic joy. These techniques of cultivating compassion and so forth are classified as concentration practices. And so we can arrive at perfect concentration through doing compassion meditations, or through loving kindness meditations, or through joy meditations. We just need to know how to use them for concentration. That's another conversation there. So, okay, those are shamatha techniques. Their salient feature is limiting the scope of our awareness, withdrawing the scope of our awareness towards something, even if it is the bare naturalness of the mind itself, withdrawing it there. Vipassana practices, or the insight practices, or special insight practices, sometimes that translation is used. Their salient feature is inquiry into something. So for something to be a true vipassana or vipassana practice, there needs to be some inquiry into something with regards to something happening. So one clear example is a very foundational practice that was taught as one of the first ones by the Buddha, and that is an inquiry into the impermanent nature of our body, for example. So we observe our body, all these sensations and so forth, and then we look into the body, specifically manifest as this network of sensations and experiences, and we ask, permanent or impermanent, ? And with our mind's ability to discern, and that ability to discern in this case is what is called wisdom, or discerning intelligence, we check every moment, changing or not changing, changing or not changing. And the more we accumulate, the more moments of accurate, correct discernment we will accumulate, the more we will accomplish the goals of that insight meditation. So what is the goal of insight meditation in this regard? Well, in general, we could say insight meditations, all of them, are about correctly understanding reality. So we could have insight meditation on, for example, the interdependence of things in the natural environment. We could have all sorts of different insight meditations with regards to the properties of physical entities. Those would be helpful and interesting and so on. But insight meditations, as used to help us on the path towards awakening, have one specific goal that is a bit more specific than that, a bit more specific than simply understanding the physical properties of something or psychological properties of something. Their main goal is to understand correctly the nature of ourself, of our mind, and of all phenomena. We have these three different approaches. I think last time we mentioned that. We can focus primarily first on ourself and on the self of all persons, and then on all phenomena. And then another approach is to focus on the nature of awareness and the object that awareness perceives, our so-called appearances. So different ways to divide reality and then understand the nature of it all. But whichever of these approaches we're using, all insight or special insight practices in this context are working against one specific problem. And in Western philosophy, there is a very helpful term for it, reification. So all insight practices in Buddhism are helping us to loosen the knots of reification or grasping. That's a more Buddhist term, but reification is very helpful here as well, because grasping might seem as if we're simply holding on to something, but that is a bit, and that's a problem of the English language, not Tibetan language. The problem arises here because we're also grasping at something or trying to hold on to something with attachment, and attachment is a much more surface level problem. So for example, grasping at our romantic partner or at our divine chocolate cake, yes, it is grasping in English, but it's grasping because of attachment, not because of profound misunderstanding of reality. Whereas reification is a very different, conveys a very different idea. So what's the difference there? What is reification? Reification is a process through which we ascribe greater reality to something than the reality that it actually has. So, for example, a clear and wonderful example of reification is looking at ourselves, at our habits, at our emotional patterns, at our woundedness and all those sorts of things, and saying, well, I'm just a Scorpio. Deal with it. You better take me as I am. And if you don't like this, whatever. So instead of seeing this as a complex network of stuff where there are some habits, there are some patterns, they're all malleable, changeable, we're not a fixed entity, we've decided that it's a fixed entity and take me or leave me. And also it's all because I'm a Scorpio. And those are some wild conclusions there, right? Not because we might not be a Scorpio or anything like that. We might be a Scorpio, conventionally speaking, but we're adding greater reality, ascribing greater reality to all of it is a case of reification. So you would meet some people, I have some friends, and no shame in that. I mean, we all deal with reality in whatever way is available to us. Astrology is incredibly soothing in that it helps us understand this wild world and be like, oh, it's just because this and that, you know, Mercury's in retrograde or whatever. Very helpful, helps us make sense of reality in some way. It also very unhelpful in some other ways. But one thing that happens, and that's what happens with me and my friends, and then we laugh about it together. And I do the same thing myself on occasion, is that we talk about something where it's like, oh, today I had this difficult conversation with my boss. So the expectation from like a Western psychological point of view is that one of us would listen empathetically, then maybe offer advice if needed, not offer advice if not needed, you know, provide space. But what tends to happen is like, oh, it's just because you're such a Scorpio, or because that he's this, or because you're both Scorpios. That's all, you know. We just like put a random label there, and we've reified these words, these concepts. We've projected greater reality to this onto these astrological explanations of stuff, because it's simpler, because any simplistic understanding of reality is more comfortable than a complex and nuanced one. That's the thing. So in a similar way, we can reify all these other things. For example, in the Hindu tradition and to a certain degree in the Buddhist tradition as well, there's that concept of Kali Yuga, the dark age. And as many people would know, Kali there does not stand for the goddess Kali. It's related to the name of the demon Kali. And so basically it's just lacking goodness and having these degenerate experiences all around, degenerate times and so forth. So sometimes instead of looking at a specific social problem and looking at all the nuances of that, or like how do we undo mechanisms of social oppression, or how do we remove racism from our society? What are the crucial points that we need to press to change this situation? We just say, oh, it's just all Kali Yuga. Of course, it's all degenerate, but you know, and then we forget about it. So once again, a reification. We have reified this idea of Kali Yuga as if just because it's Kali Yuga, someone said sometime in the past, okay, we believe it and then we kind of give up. Okay, it's all degenerate, what to do? So these are all very interesting things, but they are not to be believed, ideally, these simplifications that our mind likes to project. And amongst all of them, the greatest simplification is, of course, our belief in the fact that we are this fixed person existing in a truly existent world. So this world around us is substantially existent. This person experiencing the world is substantially existent. And that's kind of how it is. So to work against that and to see the reality of what it truly is, it's a dance of spacious, empty luminosity, we use these practices and they undo the knots of grasping, they undo the knots of reification. So we could have a course in which we do 120 different insight techniques, starting with the most coarse ones and going up to the most subtle ones. And all of those applied collectively would be incredibly helpful because they would allow us to slowly undo different layers of reification. And then on a more subtle level, once we have reached that, we would do away with the most subtle types of reification and arrive at the direct recognition of reality. In this case, for the 7 points of mind training, we are actually offered a very valuable sequence of 5 instructions on ultimate bodhicitta, out of which the first 4 are stages of meditation on emptiness or stages of insight meditation. And the 5th one is an additional instruction or instruction for session breaks. So 4 stages is already better than just 1, because you would have some systems in which you only receive 1 specific insight meditation instruction. And for us as people who did not grow up in these traditional training systems, have not been brought up with a Buddhist worldview, have not received a very profound immersion into it, for us, just having 1 instruction is really not enough in most cases, unless we are exceptionally and naturally gifted. So to do this a bit more gently, here we train in 4 stages. But even that might not be enough, so we might study more insight practices, bring them in, and once again, just expand this mode of training to a greater degree. Because every bit of insight training that we will do will contribute to the eventual success in these practices, will bring us closer to directly seeing the true nature of reality. So everything we do in the insight meditation realm, if we do it correctly, removes some of the reification, strengthens our ability to see reality correctly. So that's kind of an overall explanation of what insight practices are all about. There's some inquiry, and when these practices are for attaining liberation, awakening, they all work against reification in slow ways, sometimes in more direct and powerful ways, but for beginners, we go through all of it slowly. And then only when we have sufficiently prepared our mind will we be able to go into insight very promptly, very directly, very, very efficiently. So then there's another important foundational concept that I would like to mention before we continue with the meditation instructions themselves. You have these stories about great practitioners of the past that have received an instruction of this nature and have immediately become realized. But here we are sitting on our yoga mats and cushions and so forth, and we have heard the instructions, and we have not perhaps yet gained enlightenment, obvious enlightenment at least. Maybe you have, but I'll pretend that you haven't, because I certainly haven't. So I'm pretending to explain it to you, but actually explaining it to myself. So why are we different then from those who have just heard 1 instruction and gained direct realization? And that happened very often in the times of the Buddha himself. There's one arhat in particular one realized being in particular, who originally was a charlatan and then realized he's actually a charlatan. First, he didn't even realize it, but then he realized that he was fooling people with his made-up teachings. I was like, oh, okay, that's not good. As I'm not doing the right thing. And then he met the Buddha and he received some instructions from the Buddha. And by the time the Buddha finished his verse of teaching, that practitioner called Bahiya realized directly the true nature of reality. So what is the difference between such a being and ourselves? Yes, there's the difference in terms of having a teacher. the caliber of a Buddha. That is one factor for sure. But we are living in a time when there are incredibly realized teachers on this planet, true gems, true masters, incredible yoginis and yogis on the stages of the path are fully awakened, according to some masters. So there's no shortage of truly qualified beings that would be pouring all of this out into our information field. So the difference then is in how well we have prepared the soil of our mind. It's in having or not having adequate preparation. Some beings bring that preparation from their past lives. So very obviously in Buddhism, that's a huge thing. You prepare one lifetime after another, you work on your mind, you prepare yourself so that eventually you might be able to succeed in all these practices. What does that preparation consist of, whether undertaken in past lives or in this life? This is where we need to introduce the concept of two accumulations or two gatherings. So according to this Buddhist model, we have two banks within ourselves, two jars. And it's a very simple analogy or a very simple metaphor. And I'm going to make it much more complicated in a minute. But simply put, we have two inner bank accounts, one for pounds, one for euro. And we need to fill them both up to a certain degree. So what are these bank accounts? In Tibetan, they're called tsokni, two accumulations, which is incidentally also the name of one of the most wonderful teachers of our time, Tsoknyi Rinpoche. So the idea there is that not only does he himself possess those two accumulations, which he certainly does, we can say, by observing his teachings, his behavior, his practice, he's also skillfully guiding his students to gathering those two accumulations. But we all need them, regardless of whether we have a connection with a specific master. Everyone needs to have tsokni within themselves. So what are those tsokni? Ni is two, tsok, accumulation or gathering. One of them is called the accumulation of merit, and the other is called the accumulation of wisdom. There are other ways of translating it as well, but this is the most common one. Merit and wisdom. An accumulation of merit, an accumulation of wisdom. Okay, so now we have established that we have these two inner wallets that we have never even thought about, but they are already there. They have always been there. They've always existed. They exist within all beings, puppies and humans and bugs and ladybugs and gentleman bugs. They all have these collections already. And for all of us, these two accumulations already have something in them. And furthermore, they can never be fully exhausted. You can never fully exhaust your bank account with those because stuff has been accumulating there since beginningless time. So what are they? Merit is one of the terms loosely to denote our positive karma, our positive karmic imprints. There's a little bit more, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but to put it roughly, the energy that is given to us by our positive karma, the energy to accomplish our goals, to have good experiences, to have positive experiences. And for us, positive experiences are the experiences which we go through when our wishes are fulfilled. That fuel to have our wishes fulfilled and to enjoy the fulfillment of those wishes, and that fuel comes from positive karma. That's what's called merit, or sunam in Tibetan. Alex Berzin translates that as positive potential, which I think is also a very, very good translation. That merit kind of has a Christian connotation to it, or it might seem like we need to earn something, which in a way we do, but not in the way we think we do. So it's all confusing. But merit is a very standard and common translation as well. So merit, or positive potential, or positive force. That's what we also dedicate at the end of each session. We have created a certain amount of positive force in our mind through doing something meaningful. Let's seal it and put it there safely in the bank and also enhance it in different ways so that it doesn't all just burn out when we go out and we experience a flash of anger and all that positive force is gone like this. So what this merit thing does, and I do not regret taking time to talk about it because it will be very relevant in many aphorisms. So we're kind of stepping away from Dippas Bodhicitta temporarily, but actually we do need to know it anyway. What this merit does is that when we have it, our wishes get fulfilled more easily. When we don't have it, our wishes don't get fulfilled at all. Although I did say that we can never exhaust our merit fully, it's true that we only get access to it in installments. So no one can fully exhaust all of their merit, but it is possible to exhaust the specific installment of merit that we have access to right now. So it's like credit limit, I guess. I don't know much about banking. I've never had a credit card, only a debit one. So I guess that's kind of how it works. I guess you get a certain amount of credit per month. So with merit, because of how complex the karmic interdependence is, we only get access to specific packages of our own positive energy in specific circumstances. We might, through certain practices, dig out more. But we need to be careful with that karmic management, because if we overdo it, we might damage our next installment. So there's like very, very complex dynamic there. But basically, in every situation that we are in, it's said that we can even feel the amount of merit accessible to us through certain subtle experiences that especially become especially evident if you have done a few retreats or something like that. Because when you do intensive periods of practice, and say we all came together and we did a whole day of loving kindness meditation and compassion, and we did some prayers to Tara as well, and just, like a lovely day of practice. Not uncommon in the Tibetan tradition, where whole villages would be coming together for a period of 1 month to just recite Guru Rinpoche's mantra, for example, as a big festival, or Om Mani Padme Hum. The whole village is reciting 100 million Mani mantras. Very, very common thing in the Himalayan region. And then at the end of it, if you were to look at your mind, you would feel maybe that kind of feels different. It does not feel as flat as before. And not simply because you have strengthened the positive qualities, you attenuated the negative habits and so forth. That is important as well. But also there's that subtle vibrancy there that comes from feeling, oh, I have created some merit. It's right there. It's now at the tips of my fingers in a way that it was not before. So sometimes over time, as we practice Dharma, that merit-related sensitivity will grow, they say. And it's also said, that's actually something from Tsoknyi Rinpoche himself, that if we're feeling that our life is very flat and kind of grayish, as if there's not much joy, there's not much enjoyment in anything, not in my Dharma practice, not in eating my cakes, not in drinking my ginger shots and all those sorts of, kind of all drained, it's like depressive in like, well, sometimes people do label it as depression, but just something is drained. There are many things that could be the problem, but one major thing that he points out is that it might be that we might need to invest a lot of time into merit creating then, into replenishing our merit, because we have just experienced a period in which we don't have much merit right now. We don't have access to much merit. So we need to do something with regards to that. So sometimes when people think, oh, I just need a pill or something, but what they might actually need is some merit for creating practices. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to repeat it in brief for the Zoom people. So Rinpoche also says, Tsoknyi Rinpoche also says that it might be related to the fact that our energy drops, subtle energy drops, or bindu or tigle, are stuck in our energy system. So even if we do a tiny bit of movement or dancing or yoga, that might move the tigles through the system, and then we'll be able to also feel inspiration to create some merit. That's of course. Essence of life, yes. Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. But it's also true that, of course, it is always a bit complex in that sometimes we could say, oh, it is a chemical imbalance, or it is an energetic imbalance. Sometimes we say, oh, it's a lack of merit. Sometimes we'd say, oh, you've lost your essential life force energy, or la. Or sometimes we say, oh, you lost your other vitality energy, or tse. So it's like a whole different, there's a lot of different ways of looking at the same problem. But the solutions are also pretty much the same in that get it moving, connect to your to your basic goodness, create some merit, basically all the good things that would be a part of a day of a good Dharma practitioner. And over time, as we accumulate those habits, it kind of, the system becomes self-balancing. We're always doing all the right things, and therefore we're always, more or less, remaining in that state of joyful, energetic balance. So it's all about cultivating those positive habits. And therefore, one of those habits is to think of how to replenish, how to strengthen our positive force accumulation. So what are the practices that are done to accumulate that? Well, first of all, any sort of practice that is connected to virtuous mental states accumulates merit. So one of the most powerful ways to accumulate merit that is common to all the Buddhist traditions is meditating on loving kindness, meditating on compassion, meditating on empathetic joy and its sister rejoicing. They're often done together. Meditating on the open-hearted state of equanimity towards all beings, then combining them all into bodhicitta. So all these practices of the love side, compassion side, and we will go into them when we start training in conventional bodhicitta, they create incredibly powerful sources of merit. And the Buddha has lots of quotes, lots of teachings on how compassion is an unimaginable source of merit. So even resting for one moment in this thought, may all beings be free from suffering, or in the loving kindness thought, may all beings have happiness and the cause of happiness. These create incredible amounts of merit. So actually for secular people, that's one of the best ways to skillfully teach them that without talking about the Buddha and mantras and things like that, because that's not what they have a connection to, at least for now. But everyone has a connection to loving kindness and compassion, and that can be part of any yoga class. So then on the more quote unquote religious or the devotional side, we have practices in which we accumulate merit through what Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche called vertical love. So he would talk, and Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche is the father of Tsoknyi Rinpoche, so we're introducing you to this whole profusion of names. But don't worry about the names. I'm mentioning the source because I cannot not mention the source, that would be incorrect, that would be improper, but you don't have to worry about, who said it, who done it. That's not important at this stage. However, this one great master that lived in the 20th century and made a lot of babies who all became great masters themselves, he used to talk about two types of love that are important on the path, vertical and horizontal. So actually merit is created through these two types of love, very simply. Horizontal love is our love for fellow sentient beings. So boundless loving kindness, boundless compassion, empathetic joy. That's horizontal. That's from me, a regular being, to you, presumably a regular being. Vertical love is our love towards beings who are more realized than us. So in the Hindu tradition, that's what you would call bhakti, or devotional love. It goes up there. So in the bhakti tradition, people would have their own Ishtadevata, that would be the object of that bhakti, but it would also be quite common to have bhakti towards the guru or the teacher. So, for example, among the students of Ramdas, Krishnadas, and the rest of these wonderful guys, you have great devotion for Neem Karoli Baba, who, according to the 16th Karmapa, was a true bodhisattva. And if you read stories about him, you have no doubt about that as well. So devotion focused more on the guru or in a specific deity form, and by extension also devotion focused on Jesus or Virgin Mary or so forth. Any object is kind of suitable. Any object that embodies the beautiful virtuous qualities is an object of such vertical love. So in the Buddhist tradition, we primarily have that vertical love for the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, our immediate teachers, lineage, and root gurus, that's sometimes said. And by extension, other types of enlightened beings, dakinis, heroes, sometimes some Dharma protectors, and so forth. They're kind of all a bit more advanced, or much more advanced than we are. So we project that devotion towards them. And devotion is described in very detailed ways in the Buddhist tradition. But one important element of it, and that's actually another translation of the word that we translate as devotion itself, Möpa, is appreciation, the ability to appreciate their qualities. So how does that devotion arise? That devotion arises because I look at some holy being. For example, I look at the image of Tara, or I read the life story of Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, or I read the life story of the Buddha. Let's keep it simple. I read the life story of the Buddha. I am inspired by his qualities. I'm inspired by what he did, his teachings. And then I also think about how, from a Mahayana point of view, the Buddha's energy is still right here. We're actually abiding in his pure land. We're just not realizing that. So he's constantly surrounding us with his powerful energetic field of enlightening influence. And I think about that and I try to appreciate it. Wow, that's powerful stuff. And I can connect to that energy more strongly if I visit some of the pilgrimage sites associated with the Buddha, which I highly recommend. Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Kushinagar, Lumbini, these great sites, visiting them if you get a chance, and just feeling the Buddha's energy and presence there in these great holy sites. So a sense of appreciation arises. The Buddha is a window into my own basic goodness. How wonderful is it to have that window? That's what devotion denotes. That, combined with respect, is the Tibetan word for devotion. Möpa plus gupa. So möpa is appreciation, gupa is respect. And so respectful appreciation, wow, how incredible is it to have these things that can help me transform my mind? That's vertical love. And simply resting in that vertical love will already create a lot of merit. But in addition to that, if you do accumulation practices of a more technical nature, you would get even more merit. So this is where you're taught such practices as prostrations, which is a physical way of expressing devotion or vertical love by putting your body flat on the ground in a specific way. And it has many other benefits to it related to our channels and winds and drops and so forth. But the mental benefit is that we strengthen this vertical love and we use our body, speech, and mind to express it. And so it's a dance of that devotion energy between us and the object, strengthening the positive imprints. Some other types of, some other ways of creating merit is reciting mantras, reciting the names of the Buddhas, reciting praises, reciting or simply reading out sutras, holy texts, anything that conveys the energy of the Dharma in verbal form. So we can take any Dharma book and read it out loud to ourselves or to our pets. We're already creating merit through that. And so forth. So you have all these wonderful practices that can be very condensed or very elaborate. And amongst those, there is one specific combination of merit-creating techniques plus purification techniques that the Buddha has taught in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and that has become an absolute staple in the Tibetan tradition. And that practice or that approach is called the seven-limb practice, or the seven-limb devotion, seven-limb prayer, different ways of translating that once again. And it is sometimes expanded into more limbs. You have a 10-limb prayer as well, but seven are the most common ones. They're also used in the Chinese tradition. And there's such things as prostrating, making offerings, and so forth. So I will not unpack them fully, otherwise it will be a course on talking about all of these things instead of looking at the actual text that we're supposed to be studying. But in the resource page, I will include a link to very clear explanations of that method. It is thought to be very important to create positive potential on a daily basis. I think most practitioners of the Indo-Tibetan tradition do some form of the seven-limb practice every day. So also many do it in the Chinese tradition as well, specifically to accumulate positive potential, to remove the negative potential, which is the opposite of positive potential, meaning to remove our negative karma that creates obstacles on our path, to strengthen the positive potential that we already have, and so on. So that's all on the side of positive potential, positive karma. Meditate on love, do acts of love. Meditate on compassion, do acts of compassion. Meditate on devotion, do acts of devotion. So love of any variety will create merit, except for neurotic, deluded, afflicted love that we call love, as in like, oh, I love this chicken burger. You know, that's not going to create merit. That's not the kind of love that we are going for. But love in the clear Buddhist sense of the word, as in loving kindness and other types of love, that's a whole other discussion. But all of these virtuous mental states will create merit. So what's the deal with the other one, the other accumulation, the other bank account? That one is called the accumulation of wisdom. We could even, somewhat cheekily say, it's the accumulation of common sense, which is a correct explanation as well. Sometimes it's called accumulation of discerning awareness. So that's the part of our mind where we strengthen and accumulate our ability to discern the true nature of reality. And this is where accumulation itself becomes a somewhat inconvenient word, because whereas we can imagine putting little drops of good karma in a bucket, imagining putting little drops of wisdom in a bucket is a bit more complex, because that's not how wisdom works. It's kind of a function. It's a thing that's active in your mind. It's not simply little coins that you put somewhere. And it's for that reason that Alex Berzin actually translates to accumulations as to networks, which is actually a brilliant thing to know about as well, even if we don't use it ourselves primarily. These are accumulations, is that in that we are accumulating this stuff. But how this stuff works is not in terms of us simply putting little drops of wisdom and merit in these two big buckets. These are interconnected networks that are active. They're vibing there. They're doing this sound, the buzzing sound. And through their complex activity, they give us access to the things that are rising out of merit, success, and things that are rising out of wisdom, acts of wisdom, clear acts of clear discernment, acts of clear understanding. So everything we do to strengthen this accumulation of wisdom, or this network of wisdom, for example, every moment of every insight practice that we have ever done, that goes there. Every moment of love that we have ever experienced, and every act of love goes into our merit accumulation. So love and wisdom strengthen these two networks. And to the degree that we have strengthened them, they will bring us good results in everything that we do, and especially in our spiritual practices. So when we're doing these meditations, for example, in which we are discerning the dreamlike nature of reality, we are actively strengthening, step by step, our network of wisdom. When we're doing our love practices, we're actively strengthening our network of positive potential or merit. Eventually, we need to strengthen both to an incredible degree, and it is the beings who have done that that can receive a smack on the face with a sandal from a greatly realized yogini, and then be like, oh, okay, I'm enlightened now. Job's done. Which did happen sometimes, but took a lot of that kind of preparation. So you have the great stories of such masters as Milarepa and Marpa and Naropa, the teacher of Marpa, and many others in recent history and ancient history. And basically one fairly common thing for all of them. There are some exceptions who have brought that giftedness from past lives, but a fairly common thing to see is that for a long time, their teachers put them through this incredibly strong period of accumulation and purification. So Milarepa was made by his master Marpa to build towers and then deconstruct those towers, then build towers again, and just seemingly meaningless activity. It was meaningful because Milarepa was undertaking it with the mental state of devotion. So from that point of view, it didn't matter that he was building towers. What mattered was that he was following the instructions that he received with a very powerful wish to do anything necessary to receive the proper teachings, the proper training to transform the mind. That was what was important there. You know, the great Chinese adept of the 20th century, Master Xu Yun, who lived, I think, after 150 years or something, incredible yogi of the Chan tradition and Pure Land tradition, one of the greatest masters ever produced by China. And he spent many years of his life traveling across China to different pilgrimage sites and prostrating across his entire way. It's a common practice in the Chinese tradition called 3 steps, 1 bow. So imagine that you want to travel, I don't know, from here to Barcelona. And yes, you will take the ferry, or maybe you will go through the tunnel, but you want to travel by prostrating. So you will not walk, you will not run, you will not take a car, you will not take a bicycle. You'll just prostrate. Every 3 steps, you will do a full bow. And that way, going through the tunnel and all the way down to Barcelona, you will get there. And then you'll go from there somewhere else, and then you'll do that for 10, 20 years. And there are actually practitioners that are still doing that in the Indian subcontinent. There are people who do that in the United States even. It's not that wild. They do that specifically for this, to strengthen the positive potential network while along the way meditating on wisdom as well. And once all of that preparation is done, there is a much higher chance that we will be able to penetrate the nature of reality directly. But for most of us, we don't do these very drastic steps of only prostrating for 20 years. What we do is we do some training in the two accumulation. We do some training in merit, strengthen our love and so forth. And while doing that, we still continue meditating on these instructions. So the first one there is ponder that phenomena are like a dream. We meditate on that, and the more we do that, the more we even recall that thought in the midst of our daily activities, the more we strengthen the network of wisdom. So that's pretty good. So even if we didn't do anything else in this specific life, because maybe we're not that ambitious, we say, okay, I'll get enlightened in my future lives. Or I'll do my best in this life, I'll go into a pure land after death, and in that pure land I will accomplish enlightenment. We still would hopefully invest something into wisdom. Otherwise, we will arrive into that pure land with a very, very, very weak faculties, and it will take us a few extra eons to progress towards full awakening there. But here we have a wonderful opportunity to at least do that. So even if we just did, no, this reality is not unlike a dream. It is quite like a dream, okay. That would be quite powerful already. It is said in the teachings, and coming from Aryadeva, originally great Indian philosopher and yogi, doubt, it's the doubt that shakes the depths of samsara. So even doubting the solidity of our experiences shakes the depths of samsara, shakes the depths of our reification already. Just teeny tiny doubt that we introduced there. But then, once we have introduced this doubt about how everything we perceive exists, the next instruction there is discern the basic nature of awareness that has no arising. So now another note, another cultural note. These 4 lines, ponder that phenomena are like a dream, discern the basic nature of awareness that has no arising, the opponent itself liberates itself in its own place, the essential nature of the path is to settle within a state of the all-encompassing basis. These 4 lines can be explained and practiced in about a few dozen ways, in a few dozen different ways. So, because I have received training in a few of those, I'm faced with this very difficult dilemma of, well, which one would be most appropriate? So I think it's appropriate to start with the more gentle, slightly more conceptual approach, and then try out also the more immediate approach. If we go into the more immediate approach, some of us might get it, some of us would be completely confused as a result. Would be like, what does that even mean? I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. The slightly more conceptual, philosophical approach might be a bit more clear to establish that basis. So we'll play with both. So for the first one, the more conceptual, more philosophical approach, that is also still pretty pithy compared to some other types, some other styles. And this one, discern the basic nature of awareness that has no arising. We are supposed to then shine the light of our discerning awareness back on the mind itself. So what have we done? And we'll do it in meditation in a few moments. I'll just front load it and then we'll do it. So we have meditated on the fact that all these appearances, all these projections come from the mind. Okay. So we have we have doubted the solidity of these experiences itself, and that's what we need to do. We have established their dependence on the mind. So now we need to look at that mind that they're dependent on. One way to look at that mind, very elegant, is straight from great master Shantideva. In Shantideva's logic, and he has many actually techniques that he offers there, but one of them is, well, if the appearances are not truly established, how can the mind that they're relying on be truly established? So let's unpack that for a second. The appearances, for example, my personal holographic appearance of the phone, can only arise in reliance on the mind. I shouldn't be probably moving it because it's recording my voice. Now there's going to be horrible sounds that I made with my hand right now. Never mind. The appearance of this little envelope, the holographic appearance of this little envelope, just like in a dream, is dependent upon the mind. If there was no mind, there would be no appearance. There might have been some atoms, I don't know, doesn't matter. It's a black box, as they say in physics. Unanswerable question. Would there be atoms without a perceiver? Doesn't matter, actually. What matters is that for me, the perceived object can only arise because I have a mind, because the mind perceives it. But I look at the mind, and what I see as the mind is consciousness perceiving the envelope, awareness of the envelope. Awareness of the envelope can only arise if there is an envelope. So if there was no envelope, there would be no awareness of envelope. One cannot arise without the other. Doesn't mean that envelope created awareness, but still awareness would not be awareness of the envelope without the envelope. But then that goes for all acts of perception and cognition. Awareness of the floor is dependent upon the existence of the floor. So they're in a mutually codependent relationship. And from that point of view, it's not to say that mind does not exist or that it's created by the floor, but it's to say that the mind would always be reliant on these objects, which are not really true. And that must mean that the mind itself is not really true. There's no self-sufficient, self-existent mind if there are no self-sufficient, self-existing objects. But there are no self-sufficient, self-existing objects because they can't arise, can't be perceived without the mind. The holographic appearances would not be there if there's no mind, but the mind can only be experienced through those holographic appearances. There's no mind outside of any type of cognition. If there's no cognition, there's no mind. That's its definition, clear and knowing. And there's no knowing of anything, there's no mind. And knowing is always the knowing of something. So when we reach that stage of cognitive dissonance, just rest with it. What we have established is that we cannot find a mind that would be independently existent, and we cannot find the objects that can be independently existent. But now we're primarily focusing on the mind thing. The first one we already established to a certain degree. So we'll rest with that. No independently existing mind. The subject itself is as illusory as the objects it perceives. And we'll rest in that. That's approach number one. There's like a few dozen, a few hundred actually, but that's approach number one. So then we'll rest with it. That's already quite powerful. Approach number two, very popular in Sakya tradition, in the old Kadam tradition, and used actually by most traditions. It's the analysis of the temporal nature of the mind. So matter in Buddhist understanding is broken up into atoms. And then we can divide atoms into further particles, doesn't matter. Yeah, matter consists of particles. Okay, that's fairly clear. The mind consists of moments. And Buddhist theory, Buddhist philosophy talks about the smallest moments that we could identify, but even those can be broken up further. So mind is a sequence of mental frames, little frames like in a video, in which each frame is a specific type of mental activity. So now I'm angry, now I'm happy, now I'm joyful, now I'm sleepy, now I'm thinking about the green monkey, now I'm thinking about how green monkeys don't exist, yada, yada, yada. So there's always some content, and that content can be broken down into those tiny frames. So that's how we understand. So if we were trying to understand a physical object, we'd be breaking it into particles, and then in quantum physics, we would find, oh, geez, I don't even know if those particles truly exist outside of their connection to an observer. So it becomes very, very complex. So same with the mind. We look at the mind and how it consists of moments, and we try to find that mind. So if mind truly exists, it needs to be findable. So there's future mind, past mind, present mind. Does mind exist in the past? No, the past does not exist. It is already expired. The past is called past because it's no longer existent. Does the future exist? Not yet, obviously. It will, we'll get there. But by the time we'll get there, it will already be the present. And future is just our conceptual projection in that direction. It does not yet exist. So certainly the present must exist. The present moment of the mind must be the one that I can find, that I can identify and say, hey, that's the mind. So we'll look at the present and we understand, well, in each present moment, there must be three parts. There's the earlier part, the middle part, and the later part. So the later part is kind of the one that's more towards the future. The earlier one is the one that's becoming the past at each moment. But there's that middle one. That should be the mind. That's where the mind should be. But every quote-unquote middle moment in which we are supposedly finding ourselves has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then the middle of that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then the beginning of, and then that has a beginning, a middle, and end. So each middle part, each tiny little middle part that we try to isolate will always have three elements to it, three parts. And we zoom in on that middle one, and that has a beginning, middle, and end. And that will continue ad infinitum, infinitely. We can never identify the last middle moment that will be truly the mind right now. The present moment of the mind is unfindable. We can never isolate it. And because there's nothing that we can isolate that way, we cannot isolate any type of self-existent mind, truly established mind, truly findable mind. It kind of exists in that we experience it. Yes, the mind exists, I am aware of stuff, but we can never find one thing that we can hold the mind and say, that's it. So we go through this sequence of thinking. Deliberately, we think the past is past, the future not yet happening, the middle. Can I find the mind there in this present moment? No, it's broken up into those three parts. Can I find it in the middle of the middle? In the middle of the middle of the middle, can I find it there? We'll look deliberately. Remember, the nature of insight practices is inquiry. We'll look and we cannot find one thing that is the mind. We've established non-findability, and then we'll rest in that. So that's the second strategy. And third strategy, kind of more of a subsidiary one. If everything is like a dream, reminding ourselves of the dreams. Within dreams, we experience a specific configuration of our mind as well. So when we're in a dream, we are feeling ourselves as a specific, it's called dream persona, not fully the same person that we are in a waking state. So we temporarily see ourselves as something else, as some kind of other person. Sometimes they overlap with ourselves, and sometimes we see ourselves as a completely different person. So that person, that persona, only exists within the dream. That specific configuration of selfhood and the mind only exists with regards to the rest of what's going on in the dream. So similarly here, this so-called mind that I think is mine, this mind that is making decisions and desires and so forth, is also just a temporary configuration, illusory configuration, that exists with regards to everything else. But since everything else is ungraspable, this temporary configuration is also fleeting, temporary, ephemeral. It's breaking down when I look at it. It's just a temporary dreamlike persona or dreamlike configuration of this mind. So using that analogy with the dream and with the dream persona to see how our waking persona and all the mental activity within that, just a temporary reflection, it's in a temporary dance relationship, dance-like relationship with the things that I think are external. But the subject itself is just as illusory as the objects it perceives. And then we'll rest in that. So let's do that in meditation. And first, let's stretch a little bit. So we'll try to go through one of these sequences and see how to apply that in meditation and rest with that to strengthen our network of wisdom. And just as another note, right as we're doing that, we will apply the next instruction as well. The opponent itself liberates itself in its own place. So finding a comfortable stationary position, This practice can be done in any position, including the supine position, but many of us probably will choose to meditate in the upright position. So what we do first is we adjust the body around the central axis of our spine. Allow our breath to move naturally. And first, spend some time releasing tension to establish a fusion of stillness, silence, and spaciousness. Then to invite some inspirational energy, which we always need for such practices, we can imagine a union of all the holy enlightened beings, all the objects of our vertical love, above the crown of our head, sitting on a lotus flower and moon and sun discs. And we can either imagine our root teacher in this life if we have identified them confidently, or the Buddha, historical Buddha as the shining golden presence that unites all the objects of refuge or safe direction. And of course, the Buddha for us is also a window into our basic goodness, into our own Buddha nature. And the perfect object to strengthen our two networks, two accumulations. So we mentally, respectfully bow to the qualities of the Buddha in an act of vertical love. And we imagine different types of offerings that we freely give to create the positive potential that we need for the path. Boundless oceans of beautiful offerings manifest in our imagination and dissolving in the heart of the Buddha as we offer them freely. And also, quite important, admitting that there have been some actions, some intentions that were not particularly skillful and therefore left unskillful energetic imprints upon our mind, and we want to remove those. So freely in front of the Buddha, admitting, yes, there are some unskillful things that I'm still doing. Help me purify. But then flipping that and thinking, but there are also many things that help me express the beautiful qualities of my true nature. And many wonderful acts expressing the true nature of all beings done by those other beings. How wonderful, how amazing. So many things to rejoice in, including our shared practice and learning here today. Then to strengthen our connection with the Dharma, mentally asking the Buddha to continue abiding within our world in different forms, manifest forms, that will be guiding us towards awakening. And asking for the Buddha to continue teaching through his different emanations, And from our side, expressing a commitment to receiving and practicing and realizing those teachings, our wish to embody them. And finally, thinking of all this positive potential that we have just created and dedicating it to full awakening, so that in the long run it can ripen as full awakening or support full awakening. And in the short run, it can superpower our practice here and now. And then finally asking, inspire my mind to train in insight in ultimate bodhicitta. And opening up to that inspirational energy as it flows into us in the form of radiant rainbow-like light and nectar. And then seeing ourselves dissolve into a cloud of light, and that cloud of light, along with all the other appearances, dissolves in the form of a Buddha, so that we can experience an approximation of oneness with his enlightened mind and body and speech. And then for the main part of the practice, reminding ourselves all appearances, including these sounds that I'm hearing, as images that my eyes might be seeing, including the darkness of having my eyes closed. The smells, these tastes, these tactile sensations are arising like a dream. Like a dream, they arise dependently. Depending on causes and conditions, depending on parts that constitute a whole. And depending on my mind itself, its projections, its labeling, its interpretations, its holographic energy. We discern that and we rest in that discernment. All appearances right now are like a dream. But what is the mind that's cognizing that? What is the mind that perceives all of these appearances? The subject. Is this subjective mind, or is this mind that is the subject, independently existent? No. This mind is defined as luminosity and cognizance, and both are only expressed with regards to the mind's objects. The luminous holographic appearances pertain to the objects. Thoughts have their reference. Cognizing is always a cognition of something. Were I to look for an independent mind, it would be unfindable. Independent mind that is not interdependent never existed, it never arose, never will arise. So we rest in the unfindability of an independent mind. Such a thing cannot be found, it does not exist. Just resting there in that understanding. This unfindability is emptiness, emptiness of an independent mind. Such mind does not exist, therefore reality is empty of it. That's emptiness. But we could easily start reifying the emptiness itself and start thinking, oh, well, then the only real thing is emptiness. But emptiness is also only emptiness of something, with regards to something, pertaining to something. So it's also simply an interdependent concept. So in refusing to grasp at that emptiness, in refusing to proclaim it something that's truly ultimately existent, we fulfill the next instruction. The opponent itself liberates itself in its own place, meaning even emptiness will not become an object of our grasping. There's nothing that is not interdependent, there's nothing that is independent. So we can simply rest in clarity and spaciousness with the afterglow of these explorations. And that is the last of the 4 instructions. The essential nature of the path is to settle within a state of the all-encompassing basis. Releasing all the habitual attempts at grasping and reifying with each new exhalation. Every time we breathe out. And then from that spacious clarity, returning to the aspects of love and compassion which manifest first as a warm glow in the depths of our being, in the depths of our awareness, and then as thoughts of dedicating the positive energy of this practice, along with all the wisdom that we've been able to strengthen. And we mentally dedicate this energy to, once again, our own awakening for the benefit of all, and also to the goal of awakening the true nature of all beings. May all beings wake up to the true nature of reality. And on a more immediate basis, may all beings be free from suffering, from wars, from disease. May they never be separated from truly qualified spiritual masters that skillfully guide them towards full awakening. And may all hearts be at peace. Then finding the appearances of our body, noticing the sensations, and introducing a tiny bit of movement, rocking back and forth, moving our hands and fingers, and slowly concluding the practice. Thank you. Although a lot more can be said about these Adipas Bodhicitta or Ultimate Bodhicitta aphorisms, and we will say a few things in our next class as well, especially unpacking the terms in the third and fourth lines. I think we have established at least some basis for accumulating profound awareness or discerning intelligence or wisdom in that. Even when we consider how these outer projections work, even when we consider how this subject experiencing works, can it be independent or not, we're already strengthening those networks. Yeah? Sure. So, yeah, so Mögu itself is often translated as devotion. The thing about it is that, of course, devotion is a term, just like merit. There's quite a few terms that are borrowed from Christianity. That's where these translation choices came from. Mögu as a word consists of two terms, möpa and gupa. So möpa is actually a technical part of our mind that one of these psychological factors or functions that Asanga, whom we've already mentioned, identified and explained. So möpa is specifically our ability to appreciate something. And it does not at all only refer to objects of vertical love. Möpa or appreciation is also manifest when we appreciate a good cup or a good bowl or a good meal or having a good human body or just having a good time. So it's a technical function that when combined with gupa or respect or reverence, when they're fused together, becomes what we call devotion. The thing is, sometimes people hear devotion and they're not sure what it means. So unpacking it in this way, and that's not coming from me, but from my teachers specifically, they explained it to me this way. It actually helps. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah. I'll just repeat that for Zoom. So Taisy Rinpoche was really emphasizing that and saying that even a puppy can have a certain level of devotion in that it would bark at the perceived enemies of the person that the puppy loves, but it's not the same as Mögu, whereas actual Mögu also includes this wish to become like the object of devotion, to transform into assimilate it. But yeah, that is incredibly true. And it's also an element experientially to it of feeling that this object can help me break through the walls that I'm facing. And that's why I'm relying on it so powerfully. I want to break free, in the words of his famous song. And this is exactly the person, the being that is going to help me break free. So kind of pulling onto that is what helps us receive that inspiring energy. But because we are also having that attitude, it strengthens our network of positive potential as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the second point is, what about, yes, the mind cannot exist, or the mind does rely on the object. So the subject does rely on this, on the object. For example, our awareness of the envelope does rely on the envelope. But what about the so-called self-luminosity that can illuminate everything? There's, of course, in the Tibetan tradition, several ways of addressing that. That's where you get into the big debate between different traditions, because they think that their unique way of explaining this specific point, in addition to a few others, is the most correct one, or the most the safest one, because they think, oh, well, the explanation of that other tradition is going to confuse beings, whereas other explanation is the safest one. So that's where you have a big debate regarding that. Generally, all of these approaches seem to be bringing good results anyway. That's the position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They all are practically functional, and they will all make us good yogis. But different beings have different affinities. So one way of addressing that is to say, well, yes, we have established the reliance of the subject on the object, but then we say, well, this mind has self-luminosity, sort of. Well, that self-luminosity also only exists as a continuum of moments. Those continuum of moments, as we have established, cannot be findable when we analyze them in terms of the beginning, middle, and end. So we still come through to, even that self-luminosity cannot be discovered, cannot be identified as just one fixed thing. It does exist functionally in the same way that everything that we experience is truly experienced. So self-luminosity is experienced, but when we try to identify it, to pinpoint one specific thing, for example, temporarily in terms of the moments, not findable. Another approach is to say, well, self-luminosity is simply a function, a property. It can illuminate everything, and it does illuminate everything. It arises as all these acts of cognition. But can it be ever experienced without any of it? Some people would say yes, there is, if we were to remove all the conceptual types of cognition, no, or the perceptual first, if we were to turn off magically, and that can be done through concentration. If we were to turn off the visual, the auditory, the olfactory, and so forth, 5 types of perception, we were to deactivate those types of consciousness through going into deep concentration, we would still be left with the so-called luminous substrate, which is actually what we're going to talk about then. So there are no other external objects, and there is no gross conceptual thought in that subtle substrate of luminosity, and we're going to talk about that next time in more detail. But what it still does is that it automatically cognizes the previous moment of its own continuum. And that's how we experience the luminous quality of the mind. While it cannot experience itself in the same moment, it kind of always notices its previous moment. And because of that, once again, there is still an object to it. It's just its object is its own previous moment. Because of that, it is still reliant on an object, so that it cannot exist as a self-existing subject, and so forth. And there are many, many other sort of similar things to be explored there. Once again, some of them would be more experiential and some more conceptual, and the conceptual ones still need to be brought into this experiential domain. So whichever one works for us is the one we stay with. There are kind of dozens of logical sequences and a few experiential ones. So we have established some of the logical ones today related to logic. Next time, we're going to play around a little bit with some of Padmasambhava's instructions on the experiential quest for this thing. And that will hopefully lead us in the same direction as well. So stay tuned. That's a cliffhanger, I guess. And thank you for the lovely question. Yeah, very meaningful. Thank you, everyone, and wishing you a beautiful weekend. See you soon. And thank you to all of our digital participants. See you next time.